Your mission, should you choose to accept it, starts right now. And this one comes with secrets the network never wanted out. The show that invented the self-destructing briefing, the rubber mask reveal, and the art of the slow burn con didn't get there by playing it safe. It fired its lead actor after one season. It nearly collapsed over a religious dispute. Its theme was written in a time signature so unusual, most musicians said it couldn't be done. And the CIA, they weren't just watching. These are 20 weird facts about Mission Impossible, the 1966 television series that rewrote the rules of espionage, one impossible scheme at a time. And the bonus, the show's creator never lived to see just how deep his legacy ran. This tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Let's go. Before Peter Graves ever stepped into Jim Phelps' shoes, there was another man running the Impossible Missions force, and almost no one remembers him. His name was Dan Briggs, played by Stephen Hill, and he was the original face of the entire franchise. Hill was experienced, intense, and completely committed to the role. He had gravitas, he had the stare, he had the kind of quiet authority that made audiences lean forward and trust him with impossible stakes. The show was built around him, and season 1 delivered. But behind the scenes, something was pulling at the production in ways no director or showrunner could script around. Stephen Hill was a devout Orthodox Jew, and his faith required him to observe the Sabbath from sundown on Friday through Saturday night. In Hollywood, that meant missing shoot days. It meant stopping mid-production. It meant a schedule that the network could not sustain week after week. At first, the crew tried to accommodate him. Scenes were reordered, schedules were rearranged. Producers pulled their hair out trying to stitch a production week together around a cast member who simply could not be there when the cameras were rolling. By the end of season 1, the tension had become unsustainable. The network made a quiet decision. Hill was thanked, released, and replaced before most viewers even realized the show had changed. He didn't go quietly into obscurity, eventually becoming beloved as District Attorney Adam Schiff on Law & Order decades later. But the man who started it all, the first Impossible Mission Commander, was written out of his own show before he ever got a second season. The most recognizable piece of music in television history almost didn't exist the way you know it. Lalo Schifrin was handed the assignment to compose the theme for Mission Impossible in 1966, and he didn't play it safe. He didn't write something in 4/4 time, the standard pulse of virtually every television theme ever composed. He didn't write something in 3/4 or 6/8, he wrote it in 5/4, 5 beats per measure, an unusual, slightly off-kilter rhythm that felt like a heartbeat skipping under pressure, tense, relentless, and impossible to ignore. When he presented it to the network, the response wasn't celebratory, it was confused. Executives scratched their heads. Musicians on staff warned him that 5/4 time was too complicated for mainstream audiences, too strange for primetime television, too avant-garde to become a household sound. They pushed back. They asked for something more conventional, something easier to follow, something that didn't require listeners to count on their hands. Schifrin didn't blink. He stood behind his rhythm with a kind of conviction that only a jazz musician trained under Dizzy Gillespie could muster. Eventually, and reluctantly, the network gave in. The theme went to air exactly as Schifrin wrote it, 5 beats, no compromise. And the rest is history that still plays on radios and ringtones and movie trailers more than half a century later. It turns out, the most commercially successful television theme in history was the one everyone said audiences would never be able to follow. The rubber mask, the slow peel, the dramatic reveal of a completely different face underneath. It's one of the most copied visual tricks in the history of television, and it became the show's signature sleight of hand. But here's what most people don't know. Those masks weren't just a clever prop department solution. They were genuinely revolutionary, technically demanding, and brutally difficult to execute on a television schedule. Each mask had to be custom sculpted to fit the face of the actor wearing it, and perfectly replicate the face of whoever the character was impersonating. That meant detailed molds, hours of latex work, painstaking paint matching, and fitting sessions that consumed chunks of the production week. The illusion required the mask to move naturally when the actor spoke, smiled, or turned their head in full studio lighting, conditions that were far less forgiving than any theatrical setting. Early versions failed constantly. Edges lifted, paint cracked. Expressions went wooden under hot lights. The prop team iterated relentlessly, developing techniques that were genuinely ahead of their time. What viewers saw on screen as a 5-second reveal represented days of preparation. And the trick worked so well that fans began analyzing every character introduced in the first act, searching for the hidden seam. Mission Impossible didn't just create a visual gimmick. It rewired the way audiences watch television, teaching an entire generation to look twice at every face and trust absolutely nothing at first glance. She won 3 Emmy Awards in a row, 3 consecutive years. Barbara Bain, who played the elegant and dangerously skilled Cinnamon Carter, took home Outstanding Continued Performance by an Actress in a Drama Series in 1967, 1968, and 1969, back to back to back. It was a run of dominance that had never happened before in the history of the Emmy Awards and hasn't been repeated by any actress in the same category since. She was playing a character who used beauty, intelligence, and nerve as weapons. A woman who could walk into a room full of foreign agents and walk back out having stolen the floor plans, the code, and 3 hours of everyone's time without ever raising her voice. And Bain played it with a cool control that was almost hypnotic. On screen, she never flinched. Off screen, she was quietly accumulating one of the most remarkable award streaks in television history. The recognition wasn't just meaningful in the moment, it was historic. And yet, after season 3, she was gone. She and her then-husband Martin Landau walked away together, caught in a contract dispute with the studio that turned ugly fast. The show lost 2 of its best performers in a single move. The Emmys stopped coming for Cinnamon Carter because Cinnamon Carter simply ceased to exist. 3 trophies, 3 perfect seasons, and then silence. Barbara Bain didn't just play an impossible woman. She proved the role was irreplaceable. Martin Landau and Barbara Bain didn't just leave Mission Impossible. They detonated their contracts in a way that sent shockwaves through the production and changed the show's DNA permanently. The dispute was about money, respect, and the business of being a star on a hit series. After 3 seasons, both Landau and Bain felt their compensation didn't reflect what they meant to the show's success. Landau, who played the master of disguise raw in hand, with a theatrical brilliance that was entirely his own, had become one of television's most recognizable faces. So had Bain. Together, they were a cornerstone of the ensemble. When negotiations failed, they didn't accept less. They walked simultaneously, which, in 1969, was essentially an act of open war with a studio. The network scrambled. Leonard Nimoy was brought in to replace Landau, stepping into the master of disguise role fresh off Star Trek's cancellation. It was a logical casting choice, and Nimoy was talented, but the chemistry Landau had built over 3 years couldn't be transplanted. The audience felt it. The show kept running, kept performing, kept producing. But everyone who'd been watching from the beginning knew something had shifted. Something essential and irreplaceable had walked out the door in a salary dispute that probably could have been settled over a single afternoon. The Impossible mission that season wasn't on screen. It was in the conference room. Greg Morris played Barney Collier, the electronics and engineering genius of the IMF team, and in doing so, quietly made history that the network never heavily advertised, and the culture took decades to fully absorb. In 1966, black actors in American television were largely confined to secondary roles, supporting characters, and token appearances. Greg Morris was none of those things. He was a full member of the core cast from the very first season, given equal screen time, equal complexity, and equal stakes. Barney Collier wasn't a sidekick. He wasn't comic relief. He was frequently the reason the mission succeeded at all. His technical brilliance wasn't framed as surprising or exceptional for his race. It was simply presented as fact. Here is the smartest person in the room. Here is what he can do. And the plot proceeds accordingly. In an era when that kind of normalized integrated equality on a primetime drama was radical in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate, The show just did it quietly and without fanfare. Morris himself understood the weight of what he was doing. He received letters from black viewers, particularly children and teenagers, who said they finally saw someone like them on television, being treated like they mattered. He carried that with him for the rest of his career. Barney Collier didn't just defuse bombs and hotwire systems. He changed what primetime television was allowed to look like, one impossible mission at a time. Lucille Ball bought the show without fully knowing what she was buying. That sentence sounds wrong, but it's essentially true. By the mid-1960s, Desilu Productions, the studio Lucille Ball had co-founded with Desi Arnaz and retained control of after their divorce, was one of the most powerful independent production companies in Hollywood. Ball was running it personally, making decisions with a combination of gut instinct and hard-won business acumen. When the pitch for Mission Impossible crossed her desk, the concept was ambitious, the budget was enormous, and the network interest was lukewarm enough to make most studios walk away. The technology required was cutting edge for television. The production design was cinematic in scope. The stunts were expensive. The cast was ensemble-driven, meaning no single bankable name could carry the marketing campaign. Most of the executives around her said no. Ball said yes. She greenlit the show and put Desilu's full resources behind it. The result was one of the defining television productions of the 1960s. Shortly after the show went to air and became a hit, Desilu was purchased by Gulf and Western and rebranded as Paramount Television. But the show that launched under Lucille Ball's watch, the show she believed in when the spreadsheet said don't, went on to spawn a film franchise worth billions of dollars. She never produced a single episode of those Tom Cruise movies. But in a very real way, none of them exist without her. Yes, the self-destructing tape recorder didn't just become one of television's most iconic recurring devices. It nearly became a genuine fire hazard on set. The sequence was the same every episode. Jim Phelps receives his briefing, he listens to the mission, the message ends with a warning, and then the smoke begins. Simple enough on paper, maddening in execution. The prop team had to design and build a device that would produce visible, controlled smoke on cue, every week without setting fire to the set. The actors' hands, the furniture, or any of the 17 other things in frame that absolutely could not catch fire. Early versions were temperamental. Some produced too much smoke and triggered the studio's safety systems. Others produced too little and looked cheap on camera. Several discharged early, filling the scene with haze before the tape had finished playing. One reportedly continued smoldering after the cut was called, quietly scorching the surface it was resting on while the crew moved on to the next setup. The team eventually developed a reliable mechanism, but every episode required a fresh build, a fresh test, and a fresh prayer that the thing would cooperate on the take that mattered. Meanwhile, the network received letters from viewers asking where they could purchase one, because apparently the fantasy of receiving your mission briefing from a self-immolating tape recorder was universally appealing, which says something deeply interesting about the human relationship with drama and danger. The show's creator, Bruce Geller, was a man consumed by the idea of precision. Geller developed Mission Impossible from a spec concept into a fully realized production philosophy, and his fingerprints were on everything: the pacing, the structure, the way information was parceled out to the audience, the insistence that every episode functioned like a clock. Each episode had to work as a mechanism. Every character was a gear. Every scene advanced the plan or complicated it in a way that paid off exactly 30 minutes later. Geller didn't want spy stories. He wanted heist architecture. He wanted the audience to understand enough of the plan to feel the tension, but not so much that the twists felt dishonest. It was an extraordinarily difficult balance to strike week after week, and Geller drove his writers hard in pursuit of it. He had a specific vision and a specific voice, and he was not easy to work for when either of those things was being compromised. Writers who couldn't find the rhythm didn't last long. Directors who treated episodes as formula were replaced. Geller wanted each installment to feel like a miniature film built around an impossible problem and an elegant solution. The show that resulted from that obsessive clarity became a template that writers' rooms still study today. The procedural thriller, the ensemble heist narrative, the slow reveal, All of it traces a direct line back to a man who refused to let his creation be anything less than a precision instrument. The CIA watched Mission Impossible, not casually, not as entertainment. They watched it professionally, analytically, and with the specific interest of people who recognized some of their own techniques being dramatized on a major network television show every single week. The agency had concerns, and those concerns were documented. Former intelligence officials later confirmed that certain IMF tradecraft depicted in the series bore enough resemblance to actual field methods that it raised internal questions about the source of the show's research. How was a television production getting this close to operational concepts? Was someone talking? Was there a leak inside an agency? The show's writers were not, to anyone's knowledge, reading classified materials in their off hours. They were largely working from imagination, research into publicly available espionage literature, and a production mandate to make every con feel plausible. But plausible, when done with Geller's precision, apparently started looking uncomfortably familiar to people who ran actual impossible missions for a living. The show was reviewed at the staff level, it was discussed, and then in one of the more surreal twists in television history, elements of CIA training began quietly incorporating Mission Impossible scenarios as teaching examples, using fictional heists to train real operatives in how to think through problems of access, cover, and misdirection. The show that had borrowed the texture of espionage ended up lending it back. Not bad for 60 minutes of primetime television and a tape recorder that set itself on fire. Peter Graves almost said no. When the network approached him to replace Stephen Hill as the new commander of the Impossible Missions Force, Graves wasn't convinced the role was right for him. He had built his career playing heroes with a certain moral clarity, and Jim Phelps, as written, operated in grayer territory. The man didn't just bend rules, he dismantled them entirely in service of a mission objective. Graves sat with the scripts, read them carefully, and had genuine reservations about stepping into a show already defined by someone else's presence. What changed his mind wasn't money or prestige, it was the writing. He recognized that Phelps wasn't simply a government operative following orders. He was an architect. Every mission was his blueprint. Every team member was his responsibility. There was a quiet weight to that leadership that Graves found compelling enough to commit to fully. He signed on, showed up, and over the next 6 seasons became so completely identified with the role that most viewers forgot anyone else had ever held it. When the franchise was eventually handed to Tom Cruise decades later, Cruise's version of the story required killing Jim Phelps off as a villain, a creative choice that genuinely devastated Graves and that he never fully forgave. The man who almost didn't take the role ended up defining it permanently. The dossier scene was never supposed to be complicated. Jim Phelps opens a folder, photographs fan across a table, voices play on tape, and he selects his team. Simple, repeatable, economical television. But that sequence quietly became one of the most psychologically loaded moments in the show's weekly structure. Viewers watched it like a ritual. The photographs meant something. Each face chosen carried implicit weight. Who was needed told you everything about what kind of mission was coming. The production team understood this instinctively and began treating the selection sequence as its own form of storytelling. Prop designers made the folders feel real, weighted, classified. Photographers shot the character portraits with intentional variation, some severe, some neutral, some carrying a trace of something unreadable. It all worked because audiences invested in the team as individuals. When a familiar face wasn't selected, viewers noticed the absence like a wrong note. The show had created something television rarely managed, an ensemble where every member felt irreplaceable, and a weekly ritual that turned a practical expository device into genuine anticipation. The dossier scene wasn't just setup. It was the first act of every episode's emotional contract with the audience. The stunt work on Mission Impossible operated at a level of physical danger that the network systematically underplayed in its publicity. This wasn't accidental. Studios in the 1960s had strong commercial incentives to present production as controlled and professional, and acknowledging that performers were regularly placed in situations inches from serious injury didn't fit that narrative. But the show's action sequences were genuinely hazardous. Wire rigs failed, vehicles behaved unpredictably, practical explosions in confined studio spaces produced concussive force that nobody had fully calculated in advance. Several stunt performers sustained injuries serious enough to remove them from production mid-episode, requiring emergency recasting of background roles and schedule reshuffling that cascaded across the entire shoot week. The permanent stunt coordinator developed an internal triage system, quietly categorizing which sequences needed the most experienced performers and which risks could be managed with careful blocking. None of this appeared in press releases. What appeared in press releases was controlled excitement, daring television made by professionals. Meanwhile, on the floor, people were getting hurt, making something that looked effortless. The gap between the show audiences watched and the show that actually got made was wider and more painful than anyone in the publicity department ever let on. The show ran for 7 seasons, ended in 1973, and then did something unusual for its era. It came back. In 1988, 15 years after the original series concluded, Mission Impossible was revived with Peter Graves returning as Jim Phelps and a modernized production built around updated technology and Cold War tensions that had themselves evolved considerably. The revival ran for 2 seasons on ABC and was received with the specific warmth audiences reserve for beloved things they didn't expect to see again. It wasn't the cultural earthquake the original had been. It couldn't be. The television landscape had transformed completely around it, but it was competent, committed, and carried genuine affection for what the franchise had always represented. Graves stepped back into Phelps like no time had passed, which was either remarkable professionalism or evidence that some characters simply fit their actors the way a custom suit fits its owner. The revival's existence mattered beyond its ratings because it kept the property alive in the cultural conversation long enough for Paramount to seriously consider what a feature film version might look like. Without those 2 quiet seasons of 1988 television, the Tom Cruise films may never have been greenlit. Sometimes a revival that nobody calls a masterpiece is the most important thing a franchise ever produces. Lalo Schifrin didn't just write the theme and walk away. His musical DNA was woven through every episode's score, and his approach was as unconventional as his choice of time signature. Schifrin composed with jazz vocabulary applied to dramatic tension, percussion that suggested danger without announcing it, brass that implied momentum rather than demanding it, rhythmic structures that kept viewers in a state of controlled unease without ever tipping into full alarm. He understood that spy drama lived in the space between certainty and doubt, and he scored exactly that gap. Network executives periodically asked for something more conventional, something that telegraphed emotion more directly to audiences who might not be following every plot turn. Schifrin's answer was essentially to nod and then proceed exactly as planned. The music stayed strange, stayed precise, stayed ahead of what television scoring typically attempted. He later said he treated each episode as a short film rather than a television installment, bringing the same compositional seriousness he would have applied to a theatrical release. That philosophy produced a body of work that holds up as genuinely innovative music, completely independent of the show it was written for. The theme alone has been recorded, sampled, and covered hundreds of times. The full scores deserve as much attention as they have rarely received. Bruce Geller died in 1978, 5 years after his show ended, in a small plane crash in California. He was 47 years old. He never saw Mission Impossible become a franchise. He never saw the revival. He never sat in a theater and watched Tom Cruise sprint across a screen carrying the architecture Geller had built from scratch with a specific obsessive vision about what spy television could and should be. He built the clock, wound it, and then was gone before it struck its most consequential hours. The people who worked with him have described a man who was simultaneously demanding and generous, ferocious about quality, sincere about talent, and genuinely invested in the people who executed his vision, even when he pushed them past comfortable limits. His loss landed quietly in an industry that doesn't always stop to mark the departure of creators as loudly as it marks the departure of stars. But the show he made is still running in one form or another, still self-destructing briefings and peeling rubber masks and playing 5/4 time signatures into the ears of audiences who weren't alive when he first put it all together. Bruce Geller didn't just create a television series. He built something that refused to stop. The show tackled Cold War politics with a directness that occasionally made the State Department uncomfortable. The fictional Eastern European nations and thinly veiled Soviet-adjacent regimes that served as mission settings were constructed carefully enough to be politically legible without being diplomatically specific. But legible was sometimes enough to cause friction. Certain episodes drew quiet inquiries from government liaisons who monitored major network programming for content that might complicate ongoing foreign policy conversations. The show's production team had developed a standard response that essentially amounted to polite acknowledgement, followed by no substantive changes. Geller had no interest in writing propaganda in either direction, and even less interest in softening stories to accommodate diplomatic sensitivity. The show was fiction. The bad guys were fictional. The politics were analogous rather than literal. That argument generally held, and the State Department generally retreated to monitoring the next episode. What the friction revealed, though, was the degree to which Mission Impossible had achieved cultural mass significant enough to register as a foreign policy variable. A television show about a fictional spy team was being reviewed by actual government officials for geopolitical implications. That's not a footnote. That's a measure of genuine cultural power. Greg Morris's son, Phil Morris, eventually appeared in a Mission Impossible episode himself, creating one of television's quieter dynastic moments. The casting wasn't heavily publicized. It wasn't designed as a sentimental event or a ratings stunt. It happened because Phil Morris was a working actor and the role made sense. And in that unforced naturalness, there was something genuinely moving for anyone paying attention. A son walking through the same fictional universe his father had helped build and legitimize. The show that Greg Morris had carried with such dignity through 7 seasons and a historical moment in American television now contained his son as part of its extended legacy. Greg Morris had shown an entire generation what was possible. His son stepped into a world that partially existed because of what his father had proven. Television dynasties are usually measured in ratings and franchises. This one was measured in something quieter and more durable. Proof that the doors one generation opens stay open for the next. The format of Mission Impossible was so precisely constructed that it became a problem when writers tried to evolve it. The show's strength was its clockwork structure, the briefing, the plan, the complication, the resolution. But that same structure created a ceiling. Audiences knew the mission would succeed. The team was never going to fail permanently. The tension had to be manufactured within an outcome that was never genuinely in doubt. And sustaining that week after week across 7 seasons required increasingly elaborate complications to maintain the illusion of real stakes. Writers in later seasons openly discussed the difficulty of finding new rooms inside a format that had been so thoroughly mapped by its own success. Some episodes strained visibly under the effort. Others cracked the problem brilliantly, finding angles that made the foregone conclusion feel earned rather than inevitable. The show's legacy includes both categories. But the struggle itself produced something valuable, a masterclass in the limits and possibilities of formula television, studied by writers rooms long after the original episodes stopped airing. When Tom Cruise's Mission Impossible film premiered in 1996, it was reviewed as an action blockbuster, a summer spectacle, a franchise launcher. What it rarely got credit for being was a love letter written in the wrong language. Brian De Palma's film drew heavily from the visual grammar Geller's show had established, the disguises, the briefings, the ensemble trust, while simultaneously dismantling several of the original's most sacred elements to generate plot. Fans of the original series were divided in ways that never fully healed. The film became a phenomenon regardless, spawning sequels that each broke box office records and a cultural footprint so enormous that the 1966 television series now exists partially in its shadow. New audiences discovered the original show through the films and were surprised to find something slower, stranger, and more intellectually demanding than what Cruise had given them. Both versions are legitimate. Both carry Geller's fingerprints. One just runs faster and hangs from more helicopters. The self-destructing tape never actually self-destructed. Not properly, not reliably, not without someone sweating through the take and hoping the prop cooperated just one more time. But the show made you believe it did. Every single episode. for 7 seasons and 2 revivals in a film franchise and counting. That gap between what you know rationally and what you feel watching the smoke curl upward is exactly what Bruce Geller built his impossible machine to create. Not just television, not just espionage, the precise, repeatable manufacture of belief. This message has delivered everything it has. You know what happens next.